The community of Willow Creek had always prided itself on its clean sidewalks, manicured lawns, and neatly painted houses. From the outside, it looked like the picture-perfect suburb. Families walking their dogs, children riding their bikes, and retirees tending to flower beds in the late afternoon sun. For years, the Homeowners Association had enforced its rules with a heavy hand but little pushback. Most residents complied, sometimes reluctantly, because they wanted to keep their property values intact and avoid unnecessary conflict. But beneath that surface of harmony, frustrations simmered. The HOA board members had always been strict about everything from the length of grass to the color of mailboxes. Yet most people endured it because, in their eyes, these were small inconveniences. That perception changed the moment the board decided to target something deeply personal: pets. Out of nowhere, the HOA announced a sweeping rule banning all non-service animals from the neighborhood. The explanation was vague, citing noise disturbances and sanitation concerns. But to the families who had beloved dogs, cats, rabbits, and birds, the announcement felt like a direct attack on their lives. At first, the news spread slowly, like whispers on the wind. Neighbors muttered in disbelief, wondering if they had misunderstood the bulletin. But when official letters arrived in the mailboxes, stamped with the HOA seal, the reality set in. Owners were told to rehome their pets within 30 days or face fines of hundreds of dollars per week. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. Families who had raised their dogs from puppies, who considered their cats as part of the household, now faced the horrifying thought of giving them away. The outrage was immediate, but the board seemed unshaken. The pushback began with hushed conversations at kitchen tables. Families debated their options. Some considered hiring lawyers. Others thought about moving out entirely. But selling a house was not easy, especially when the rule affected every potential buyer who might also own pets. The HOA, it seemed, had created a trap. Still, there was a quiet resilience in Willow Creek, and that resilience would soon find an unlikely form of resistance. The first sparks of rebellion came from a handful of neighbors who felt there had to be a way to fight back without going through endless legal battles. They knew the HOA thrived on fear, on residents believing they had no choice but to obey. But what if the entire neighborhood acted together? What if, instead of quietly submitting, they turned the rule on its head? It started with a single family who had already been ordered to get rid of their dog. Instead of giving up, they brought in 2 chickens. At first, it was meant as a joke, a sarcastic gesture against the absurdity of the rule. Chickens, after all, weren't considered pets in the same way cats or dogs were. They were livestock, and nowhere in the HOA's carefully worded ban did it mention livestock. To their amusement, the HOA had no immediate grounds to fine them. The loophole had been found. Word of this act of defiance spread quickly. Soon, another family brought in a few hens. Then another neighbor added a coop to their backyard. Within a matter of weeks, the sound of clucking replaced the barking that the HOA had so desperately tried to eliminate. The neat, uniform neighborhood began transforming into something entirely unexpected, a patchwork of mini-farms, each with its own feathered residents. At first, the board dismissed it as an isolated stunt, but as the number of chickens grew, so did the HOA's panic. The once pristine lawns now had coops, feed bins, and the occasional chicken wandering across the road. Families that had never spoken much to each other began bonding over the shared rebellion. They exchanged tips on feed, coop construction, and egg collection. Children who had cried at the thought of losing their pets now laughed as they chased after the birds. What began as a moment of despair had turned into an unlikely symbol of community. The HOA meetings grew more tense with each passing week. The board members sat stone-faced as residents demanded explanations. How could they justify banning beloved dogs and cats while the streets now echoed with the sound of clucking? The board argued it was a matter of maintaining order, but the residents weren't buying it. The chickens had exposed the weakness of the HOA's authority. They had shown that rules could be bent, twisted, and ultimately used against those who enforced them. But while many laughed at the absurdity of it all, there were storm clouds brewing. The HOA was not used to being challenged, and they were not about to let their authority be mocked so openly. Rumors began circulating that the board was drafting new regulations, this time aimed directly at the chickens. The residents knew they had struck a nerve. The question was, how far would the HOA go to reassert control, and how far were the residents willing to push back? By the end of the first month, Willow Creek no longer looked like the pristine suburban enclave it once had been. Instead, it had become a curious mix of suburbia and countryside, where neighbors gathered not for barbecues, but to share fresh eggs and laugh about their collective defiance. It was a strange new identity for the community, one built not on the HOA's rigid rules, but on solidarity against them. Still, beneath the humor and camaraderie, there was an undercurrent of tension. Everyone knew the HOA would strike back eventually. Everyone wondered just what kind of retaliation was coming. And deep down, everyone feared that the chickens, which had become symbols of Resistano Paz, stance might soon become targets in a battle that was only just beginning. As the weeks passed, Willow Creek found itself at a crossroads. The chickens that had started as a joke had multiplied into a full-blown movement. Nearly every household that once had a pet now had a coop, and the neighborhood had taken on an entirely new atmosphere. Instead of barking dogs, there was the steady rhythm of clucking hens. Instead of HOA newsletters boasting about pristine lawns, there were Facebook posts from residents proudly showing off baskets of fresh eggs. The community had never felt closer, yet never been more divided from the board that was supposed to represent them. The HOA board members watched this transformation with growing outrage. They had always seen themselves as the guardians of order, the gatekeepers of property value, the final authority on what made Willow Creek desirable. To them, the sudden appearance of chickens was more than just a nuisance. It was an outright mockery of their power. Their carefully written rules had been twisted, and instead of compliance, they had received open defiance. For the first time in years, the board was not in control, and that realization burned deeply. Behind closed doors, the HOA convened emergency meetings. The discussions were bitter, filled with blame and panic. Some members argued that the residents needed to be fined heavily until they relented. Others pushed for rewriting the bylaws entirely to outlaw livestock in all forms. A particularly vocal faction suggested contacting county animal control, hoping that outside authorities would succeed where their own rules had failed. The board's tone shifted from annoyance to desperation, and desperation, as the residents would soon learn, made the HOA dangerous. The first sign of retaliation came quietly. Official letters began arriving again, this time citing health and sanitation concerns. The board claimed that chickens posed risks of disease, that their coops were attracting pests, and that the neighborhood was no longer safe. Attached to each letter was a threat. Remove the chickens within 15 days or face fines of up to $500 per week. The numbers were deliberately steep, designed to scare residents into submission. But Willow Creek had changed. Where once residents might have quietly paid their fines or grumbled in silence, now they compared notes and rallied together. They realized that every family had received the same letter, and that the HOA was once again relying on fear to divide them. Instead of backing down, they pushed forward. Some families doubled the size of their coops. Others painted bright signs mocking the HOA, declaring, "Fresh eggs, not HOA rules." What had begun as resistance was now becoming a full-scale rebellion. The HOA, furious at being ignored, escalated further. They began issuing fines, sending official notices with bold red stamps to make them seem more threatening. For many residents, these letters arrived like clockwork, piling up on kitchen counters and in mailboxes. Yet when residents compared them, they noticed inconsistencies. Different dates, mismatched wording, even legal citations that didn't exist. The HOA was sloppy, and the community saw through it. Still, the pressure mounted. Some families, particularly those with tighter budgets, grew nervous. Fines weren't just paper. They represented real money that could affect mortgages, bills, and daily life. Fear crept back into the conversations, and for the first time since the chickens arrived, cracks began to show in the residents' solidarity. The board sensed this weakness and leaned into it. They spread rumors that liens could be placed on homes, that refusal to comply might lead to foreclosure. The intent was clear: divide the neighborhood and conquer it piece by piece. But then something unexpected happened. A retired couple on the edge of the neighborhood, who had once kept quiet about their grievances, stepped forward with information that changed everything. They revealed that the HOA board itself had violated multiple rules for years, using HOA funds for private landscaping, holding secret meetings without quorum, and even approving exceptions for board members' own properties. The hypocrisy was staggering, and once exposed, it lit a fire under the residents like never before. The chickens were no longer just a loophole, they were a symbol of justice. If the board could bend the rules for themselves, why couldn't the residents bend them in return? The neighborhood began gathering evidence, compiling documents, and photographing every inconsistency they could find. The rebellion was evolving from symbolic gestures into a calculated counterattack. The HOA board, sensing that the situation was slipping out of their control, decided to escalate once again. This time, they moved beyond fines and threats. They contacted county authorities, filing complaints about illegal livestock operations within the community. They described Willow Creek as a neighborhood in decline, plagued by noise, smells, and health hazards. Their hope was clear. If the residents would not obey them, perhaps outside forces would crush the movement. When the first county inspector drove into Willow Creek, the residents felt both fear and resolve. The HOA watched smugly from their porches, certain that the rebellion would crumble under official scrutiny. But the residents had prepared. Their coops were clean, their birds were healthy, and every family stood ready to defend their choices. The inspector walked the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, noting the unusual but well-kept yards. To everyone's surprise, the verdict was far from what the HOA had hoped. The county inspector found no serious violations. The chickens, while unusual, were not illegal under local ordinances. The coops met basic safety standards, and the neighborhood, though unconventional, was not in violation of health codes. The inspector left with little more than a few recommendations for waste disposal. The residents celebrated quietly, but the HOA fumed. Their attempt to weaponize outside authority had backfired spectacularly. Now the stakes were higher than ever. The residents had tasted victory, but the HOA had been humiliated, and humiliation was a wound that would not heal easily. Both sides dug in, preparing for the next phase of the battle. What had started as a fight over pets had grown into something much larger, a struggle for control of the community itself. The chickens were still clucking, the eggs were still being shared, and the spirit of defiance was alive and well. But everyone knew the HOA would not give up. They were plotting their next move, and when it came, it would be bigger, harsher, and aimed directly at breaking the will of Willow Creek. The neighborhood had won the first round, but the war was far from over. The morning after the county inspector's visit, Willow Creek felt strangely quiet. The residents, relieved by the inspector's favorable report, went about their routines with a renewed sense of pride. They collected eggs, fed their chickens, and smiled knowingly at one another when passing on the sidewalk. It was as though the rebellion had survived its first true test, and everyone could finally breathe again. But that peace was deceptive. The HOA board was already planning its counterstrike, and this time they had no intention of failing. The board's anger boiled over in private meetings. They had expected the county inspector to validate their claims, to declare the chickens a violation and force compliance. Instead, they had been publicly embarrassed. Worse still, the residents were emboldened, flaunting their coops like trophies. The board's authority, once absolute, was slipping away with every cluck and every shared basket of eggs. They could not allow this rebellion to become permanent, for if the residents realized they could defy one rule, they might question all the others. The first part of the board's revenge came in the form of financial pressure. They rewrote the monthly HOA dues structure, adding community upkeep fees that conveniently coincided with the appearance of chickens. The justification was thin, claiming that increased sanitation costs required additional funds. But the timing was obvious. Every household saw their dues rise sharply, regardless of whether they owned chickens or not. The intent was clear. Make life expensive. Make the rebellion painful. At first, the residents grumbled but paid. Yet as the weeks went on, the fees piled up, and resentment grew. Some families on fixed incomes struggled, while others outright refused to comply. This refusal only deepened the rift. The board began issuing threats of liens, waving legal jargon in letters designed to intimidate. For families already worried about finances, the stress was crushing. The board had found a weapon that could not be ignored. But the residents were not without answers. Together they pooled resources, offering to cover dues for the hardest-hit families. Younger neighbors helped retirees clean and maintain coops, lessening the burden of care. A barter system quietly emerged, where eggs, vegetables, and even handyman work were exchanged instead of money. What the board intended as financial punishment inadvertently fostered an even tighter sense of community. The rebellion was evolving into something far stronger than a protest. It was becoming a way of life. The board, seeing their aid falter, escalated further. This time they turned to the courts. They hired a lawyer known for aggressive tactics and filed a lawsuit against several residents, claiming the chickens violated the spirit of the HOA bylaws. The language was vague, designed to drag the matter into costly litigation. Notices were served, and fear spread like wildfire. Court was not a place most families were prepared to go. The HOA believed the mere threat of legal action would fracture the community, forcing compliance. But once again, Willow Creek surprised them. The residents who had been served rallied their neighbors. Meetings were held in living rooms and backyards where strategies were discussed. A local attorney, sympathetic to their cause, offered discounted rates to represent them. Donations poured in to cover legal fees, with families contributing whatever they could. It became clear that the lawsuit, far from breaking the community, was uniting it in a common cause. The HOA had underestimated just how deep the residents' defiance ran. Still, the legal battle loomed large. Papers were filed, motions submitted, and dates set. For many, the thought of standing in court against their own board was terrifying. But as the day approached, the community grew bolder. They began documenting everything: photographs of clean coops, testimonies about noise levels, records of egg donations to local shelters. Their defense was not just about chickens anymore. It was about proving that the HOA had overstepped, that its thirst for control had gone too far. The board, however, had one more trick up its sleeve. Quietly, they began feeding stories to local news outlets. Articles appeared painting Willow Creek as a once beautiful community, now ruined by rogue residents running unregulated farms. Headlines warned of plummeting property values, of infestations, of chaos. The board wanted to turn public opinion against the residents, isolating them and making them look foolish. For a moment, the tactic seemed to work. Strangers drove by to gawk at the chickens. Some even scoffed at the idea of a suburban neighborhood turning into a makeshift farm. But then, the residents turned the narrative around. They invited reporters to see the reality. Clean coops, happy families, children learning responsibility, neighbors sharing food. They showed baskets of fresh eggs donated to local food banks, stories of retirees finding joy in caring for hens, and evidence that property values were holding steady. What the board intended as a smear campaign instead became free publicity for a neighborhood standing up for itself. The story spread online, and Willow Creek became a symbol of resistance against overbearing HOAs everywhere. By the end of the third month, the lines had been drawn more clearly than ever. The chickens were still there, the residents were stronger than before, and the HOA was angrier than ever. The lawsuit loomed ahead, promising to be the decisive battle. For the board, it was their last chance to crush the rebellion. For the residents, it was a chance to prove once and for all that the HOA's reign of fear was over. As neighbors prepared for the courtroom showdown, tensions ran high. The once quiet streets of Willow Creek now buzzed with anticipation. The HOA was sharpening its legal weapons, the residents were gathering their defenses, and everyone knew that what happened next would change the community forever. The fight over chickens had grown into something much larger. It was no longer about pets or coops or even bylaws. It was about freedom, fairness, and who truly held the power in Willow Creek. And as the court date drew closer, both sides braced for the clash that would decide the future of the neighborhood. The morning of the trial arrived with an air of quiet tension that swept across Willow Creek. For the residents had prepared themselves for this day, gathering evidence, meeting with their lawyer, and reminding each other why they had chosen to fight. The chickens were no longer just animals. They were symbols of freedom, defiance, and unity. Every egg collected, every coop cleaned, had been part of a larger battle. Now, all of that resolve would be tested inside a courtroom where the HOA was determined to reassert its dominance. The courthouse loomed with intimidating walls of brick and glass, a place designed to instill seriousness. As residents arrived, they were met with the stern faces of the HOA board members and their attorney, a sharp man in a tailored suit who radiated confidence. He looked at the residents as though they were children about to be scolded. The board sat stiffly beside him, convinced that the law was on their side, that once the judge heard their arguments, the chickens would be banished and order restored. But the residents had not come unprepared. They filed into the courtroom with their attorney, a woman who, though less flashy, carried herself with quiet strength. She had spent hours poring over the HOA's bylaws, highlighting contradictions and hypocrisies. She had encouraged the community to collect records, photographs, and testimonies, turning the case into something much bigger than a fight over chickens. This was no longer a simple dispute. It was a trial about fairness, about abuse of power, and about the right of residents to live without unreasonable interference. When the proceedings began, the HOA's attorney wasted no time painting a grim picture. He described Willow Creek as a once pristine neighborhood now overrun by noise, odors, and livestock. He argued that the chickens violated the spirit of the community's rules, even if the bylaws did not specifically mention them. He warned of plummeting property values, disease, and a neighborhood descending into chaos. His words were dramatic, his tone sharp, designed to frighten the judge into siding with the board. For a moment, the residents felt the weight of his words. He spoke with authority, and the board members nodded smugly at each point. But then came the residents' turn. Their attorney rose calmly, her voice measured, her arguments precise. She began by pointing out the obvious. Nowhere in the HOA's bylaws did it say that chickens were prohibited. The rules banned dogs, cats, and common household pets, but livestock was never addressed. By exploiting this oversight, the residents had broken no law, no bylaw, and no rule. She then went further, introducing evidence that shook the courtroom. Financial records showing misuse of HOA funds, photographs of board members violating their own regulations, and testimonies from neighbors about selective enforcement of rules. The hypocrisy of the board was laid bare for all to see. What began as a case about chickens was slowly becoming a case about the integrity of the HOA itself. The judge listened carefully, expression unreadable. Witnesses were called, residents who spoke about the joy the chickens had brought, children who had learned responsibility by caring for them, retirees who found purpose in their daily routines. One after another, they described how the chickens had strengthened the community rather than harmed it. They spoke of shared eggs, laughter, and cooperation. It was not a story of chaos, but of solidarity. The HOA's attorney grew visibly frustrated. He countered with more warnings of disease and disruption, but when pressed for evidence, he had little to show. There were no health violations on record, no complaints from local authorities, and no proof of property values declining. His arguments began to crumble under the weight of facts, and the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then came the turning point. The resident's attorney introduced the testimony of the county inspector who had visited weeks earlier. Calm and professional, the inspector confirmed that the chickens posed no health hazards, that the coops were maintained properly, and that the neighborhood was not in violation of any local ordinances. The HOA's case had hinged on the idea of danger, but the inspector's words cut that argument apart. As the trial stretched on, the mood in the courtroom shifted. What had started as a battle over animals was revealing something deeper, a board that had overstepped its authority, weaponizing rules to control and intimidate. The residents had not only defended their right to keep chickens, they had exposed the flaws and corruption within the HOA itself. By the time both sides delivered their closing arguments, the atmosphere was electric. The HOA's attorney tried to salvage what he could, appealing to tradition, order, and the need to protect property values. But his words rang hollow compared to the stories of families, neighbors, and community spirit that the residents had presented. The judge did not deliver an immediate ruling. Instead, he announced that he would take the matter under consideration and issue a decision in the coming weeks. It was a standard procedure, but to the residents, it felt like another waiting game, another chance for anxiety to creep in. Still, they walked out of the courthouse with heads held high. They had faced the board on equal footing, and for the first time the outcome felt uncertain. The HOA board, however, was not ready to concede. As they left the courthouse, their anger was palpable. They had been embarrassed, their authority questioned, and their secrets exposed. If the courtroom did not give them the victory they sought, they would find other ways. They whispered among themselves, plotting their next moves. For them, this was no longer about chickens. It was about crushing defiance before it spread further. Back in Willow Creek, the residents waited nervously. The chickens continued to roam their coops, the eggs continued to be collected, and life went on. But everyone knew that the fight was not over. Whether the judge ruled in their favor or against them, the HOA would not stop until it regained control. And so, the community braced itself, knowing that the most dangerous phase of the battle was yet to come. The court had become a battlefield, but the real war for Willow Creek's future was only beginning. End of Chapter 4. The weeks following the courtroom showdown were some of the most anxious Willow Creek had ever experienced. Every day felt heavy with anticipation. Every trip to the mailbox carried the weight of possible news. The residents busied themselves with routine, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, tending to gardens. But behind every smile was a gnawing sense of uncertainty. Would the judge side with fairness and freedom, or would the HOA's fear tactics prevail? When the decision finally came, it arrived in a plain white envelope, its official seal breaking the silence of the waiting game. Word spread quickly, neighbors rushing to each other's doors, calling, texting, and gathering in clusters along the sidewalks. The verdict was clear. The residents had won. The judge ruled that the chickens did not violate the HOA bylaws. The board's claims about noise, sanitation, and property values had no factual basis, and their attempt to weaponize vague language had failed. The case was dismissed, and the residents were free to keep their chickens. The eruption of joy across Willow Creek was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Families cheered, children ran through the streets, and neighbors hugged each other as though they had just won a championship. The chickens, oblivious to the human drama, clucked happily in their coops, unaware that they had become the heroes of a community-wide revolution. For the first time in months, the residents felt secure. They had stood up to the HOA and won. But victory, as sweet as it was, carried consequences. The HOA board sat in their office, seething with resentment. They had been humiliated in court, exposed for their hypocrisy, and defeated in front of the very people they sought to control. Their authority, once unquestioned, now hung by a thread. If the residents could defy them on this issue, what would stop them from challenging other rules? Their power was slipping away, and in their eyes, that was unacceptable. The retaliation began almost immediately. The board, unable to remove the chickens, turned to pettiness. They began issuing violation notices for the smallest infractions: a lawn 2 inches too tall, a trash bin left out a few minutes too long, a holiday decoration that exceeded approved dimensions. Each letter was a reminder that the board still had claws, and they intended to use them. For many residents, the sudden surge of fines and warnings was exhausting. They had fought so hard in court, only to find themselves trapped in a new cycle of harassment. But instead of fracturing the community, the board's tactics once again united it. Neighbors began sharing resources, lawnmowers, paint, tools, to ensure that nobody could be targeted alone. Families helped each other correct supposed violations within hours, making the board's attempts at control look ridiculous. The HOA grew more desperate. They held emergency meetings, shouting matches breaking out among board members as they debated their next steps. Some argued that they should accept defeat and move on. Others, particularly the president, insisted that the chickens were a symbol of rebellion that had to be crushed at all costs. The board was no longer simply enforcing rules, they were fighting for their pride. Meanwhile, the residents leaned deeper into their new identity. Willow Creek was no longer just another cookie-cutter suburb. It had become something unique, something vibrant. Families built larger coops, some adding ducks and geese to their flocks. Community events centered around shared meals of eggs, fresh produce, and laughter. What had once been a quiet, controlled neighborhood now pulsed with life and solidarity. The board watched in horror as their vision of Willow Creek slipped away. To them, it was chaos. To the residents, it was freedom. The divide grew sharper with every passing week. Then came the breaking point. The HOA, in a final act of desperation, filed for an emergency amendment to the bylaws. This amendment, if passed, would explicitly ban all forms of livestock, including chickens, ducks, and anything else the residents might use as a loophole. The vote would be held in secret, with board members lobbying quietly for support. Their hope was that apathy would win, that enough residents would ignore the vote, allowing the board to push through their ban unnoticed. But the residents had grown wise. They discovered the plan and began organizing once again. Meetings were held in living rooms and backyards, strategies whispered across fences, flyers distributed quietly but effectively. The residents knew that this vote was the board's last weapon, the final attempt to undo everything they had fought for. If they lost, the chickens would be gone. If they won, the HOA's grip on Willow Creek would shatter completely. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown, not in a courtroom but in the heart of the neighborhood itself. The upcoming vote would decide not only the fate of the chickens, but the very soul of Willow Creek. The residents prepared themselves, determined not to be caught off guard. The board sharpened their tactics, ready to use every ounce of influence to claw back control. Both sides understood the stakes. This was no longer about pets, bylaws, or even chickens. It was about power, pride, and the future of a community that had become, as in forever changed. As the day of the vote approached, tension blanketed Willow Creek like a storm cloud. The residents held their breath, the board sharpened their knives, and the chickens clucked on, unaware that they were at the center of a battle that would define everything. The day of the vote dawned gray and heavy, as though the weather itself reflected the weight pressing down on Willow Creek. For weeks, whispers and rumors had spread through the neighborhood. Flyers had been tucked into mailboxes, secret conversations had taken place at kitchen tables, and alliances had been forged across backyard fences. Everyone knew what was at stake. This was not simply a vote on chickens. It was a decision about freedom, community, and whether the residents of Willow Creek would live under fear or stand together as one. The HOA board had done everything in its power to stack the deck. They lobbied quietly, cornering residents one by one to remind them of property values and neighborhood standards. They painted dire pictures of chaos, lawns turned into farms, streets filled with noise, homes losing their value. They appealed to fear, hoping that the promise of order would sway just enough households to tip the scales. But the residents were not the same timid group they had once been. The chickens had changed them. They had stood together in court, shared meals, traded tools, and watched out for one another. They had become more than neighbors. They had become a community, and that bond was stronger than any scare tactic. The vote was scheduled for the evening, in the community hall that had once been the site of HOA triumphs. The building was packed wall to wall, chairs filled with residents, the air buzzing with tension. On one side of the room sat the board, stiff and stone-faced, their pride hanging by a thread. On the other side sat the families, many wearing shirts with chickens printed on them, a quiet but powerful show of solidarity. When the time came, ballots were handed out. The amendment was clear. All livestock, including chickens, ducks, and similar animals, are hereby prohibited within Willow Creek. A simple yes or no, but the choice carried the weight of everything the residents had endured. One by one, ballots were marked, folded, and dropped into the box. The scratching of pens was the only sound in the room, each stroke echoing louder than the last. When the final ballot was cast, the box was carried to the front of the hall. The air grew still, the silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. The count began. Each ballot was unfolded and read aloud. Yes. No. No. Yes. The rhythm was steady, the numbers climbing. The board sat rigid, their eyes fixed on the growing tally. The residents leaned forward, every heartbeat syncing with the cadence of the count. As the final votes were revealed, it became clear. The amendment had failed. By a wide margin, the residents had spoken. The chickens would stay. The room erupted in cheers, the sound of victory shaking the walls. Neighbors hugged, children jumped in the air, and a chant of "Chickens! Chickens!" broke out among the crowd. The board sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and tight. Their last weapon had failed, their authority shattered before their very eyes. The president of the HOA rose slowly, his voice sharp as he declared that the board would continue to enforce the rules as written. But the words fell flat. No one listened. No one cared. The residents had taken their power back, and there was no returning to the way things had been. In the days that followed, Willow Creek transformed. The chickens remained, clucking proudly in their coops as if they knew they had been part of something extraordinary. Residents built stronger bonds, organizing community events, barbecues, and even a small farmer's market where eggs and produce were shared. What had begun as defiance had blossomed into unity, and the neighborhood thrived like never before. The HOA still existed, but its shadow had been diminished. Its letters and warnings carried little weight now. Residents knew they could resist, knew they could stand together and push back. The fear that once defined life in Willow Creek had been replaced with confidence and camaraderie. For the board, the defeat was crushing. Some members resigned, unwilling to endure the humiliation. Others clung to their positions, their bitterness growing with each passing day. But their reign of unchecked power was over. They had underestimated the strength of a united community, and they had paid the price. As the seasons changed, Willow Creek became known not for its strict rules or manicured lawns, but for its spirit. Visitors came and marveled at the sight of families laughing in their gardens, children chasing chickens across the grass, and neighbors working together instead of competing. What the board had tried to crush had instead given the community its soul. The chickens clucked on, unaware of the battles fought in their name. To the residents, they were more than pets now. They were a symbol, a reminder that even in the face of control and fear, ordinary people could rise up, stand together, and reclaim their freedom. And so, Willow Creek moved forward, not as a neighborhood ruled by fear, but as a community defined by solidarity. The HOA remained a formality, a relic of the past. But the people had proven that power belonged not to a board, but to those willing to fight for their homes, their families, and their right to live freely. The chickens had stayed, the people had won, and Willow Creek had become something greater than anyone had ever imagined.